It all started with the story of a poor boy getting the proverbial and literal golden ticket inside of a chocolate bar he only could afford after serendipitously finding just enough money on the street. A golden ticket which would give him the chance of a lifetime to go on an unforgettable journey inside the factory of the mysterious chocolatier Willy Wonka and uncovering the secrets that lay within. Such was the children's book released in 1964 by author Roald Dahl. 7 years later, in 1971, Hollywood would release a film adaptation titled Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, starring Gene Wilder, in what came to be among the most iconic performances and recognizable films in cinema history, with many a moviegoer's childhood being touched by this film in ways both magical and sometimes menacing. Though, while so iconic now, the 1971 film was not a commercial success, and it was only over the decades to come with home viewing that it became the cult classic it is considered today. Fast forward 52 years with the release of Wonka, we have an origin story that takes the Wonka universe in some different directions, and whether these directions will appeal to you will depend on what you may or may not be looking for from these films. Hey everyone, and welcome to this channel. Quickly before we continue, I wanted to let you know, if you're new here, that my goal will always be to offer a balanced perspective covering what I consider to be the positive aspects of film, as I recognize every film objectively has merits worth mentioning, no matter what I think of it as a whole, followed by my critiques and criticisms, and finished off with an overall impression. All of this is with the intention of assisting the viewer in making up their own mind, as in the end, the most important conclusions will always be your own. So thank you for joining me, and let's continue. Now, with Wonka serving as an origin story to the titular character in the 1971 film, it centers on his formative years when he had nothing to his name besides his abilities as a chocolatier. Arriving in the big city that he had only dreamed about until now, he sets about making his dreams come true, and the script makes sure you couldn't possibly misunderstand his plight, going so far as counting down his last few coins one by one as they're spent, and daydreaming his future life and storefront into reality with the first musical number, even cleverly combining these two elements as he's taxed for that daydreaming. Soon enough, however, he quickly runs into opposition from multiple fronts, by those on low who would prey upon a naive character who is essentially homeless at that time, as well as by those on high who consider they have a monopoly on chocolate, with Wonka being a talented usurper and threat to the status quo. A status quo of chocolate needing to be simple but also conveniently a price-hike luxury good, with its distribution controlled by mafia-like tactics. The film takes you on the journey of how he overcomes these obstacles with kindred spirits he meets on the way, while always remaining optimistic in the face of any adversity. Regardless of whether or not you're a believer in auteur theory, which for context suggests that a film, similar to a painting for example, has a primary author through evidence of a distinguishable style and approach, just like a Rembrandt painting would be very easily identifiable as a Rembrandt, but even not going as far as that, it's safe to say a film is undoubtedly the sum of its parts, in the sense that the final outcome is a product of all the key artistic driving forces involved in its creation. With that understanding, 2023's Wonka, starring Timothée Chalamet and directed by Paul King, is very much its own entity, standing distinctly apart in its creative cogs from the 1971 film it's acting as a prequel to, with the original film being able to be sincere and saccharine, with songs like Cheer Up Charlie to surreal and menacing, as in the famous boat ride scene. It ran the gamut of sensibilities. Whereas with 2023's Wonka, you have an atmosphere which is vastly more deliberate and less ambiguous, with the characters, both good or bad, cut from a very transparent cloth. Though, to be fair, much of this has to do with what you could get away with in a major commercial film 50 plus years ago compared to today, where major studio films having ambiguous characters without very clear and choreographable intentions not exactly being commonplace. So what are the things I consider to be the positives in Wonka, which I will cover before moving on to my critiques? Very similar to Paddington 1 and 2, which are the most recent films by director Paul King and what he became known for, Wonka has an emotive and warm-hearted magical realism at its core that I think succeeds on multiple levels. The film has a lot of sweet charm to it, and it does its best to give you a temporary portal out of reality into a more magical world, one where you can pull teapots out of hats, confections can make you fly, as well as a handful of other small miracles. The film plays on your heartstrings in ways that invite you to care about the protagonists with no risk whatsoever on your behalf, as there is no ambiguity or thinking required. This is a very easy watch that just allows you to sit back and witness the magic unfold across the many light-hearted escapades and enjoyable musical numbers that, ironically, unlike Wonka's chocolates, make you feel good but never go further than they have to. Timothée Chalamet's performance is also endearing and joyful, and considering the by-the-numbers film this is, and therefore what he was given to work with, it's hard to find much fault in it, as its lack of dimensionality is not of his doing, and I'm sure he could have done more with it if given the chance. This is not a film that delves into any grey areas, and director Paul King very much leans into this lack of ambiguity by making each protagonist good-natured and sympathetic, and every antagonist as mustache-twirling as it gets, allowing this storybook-style juxtaposition to play out like a sweet children's tale, which is uncoincidentally the core audience for the film. It should be said Wonka is also supplemented by quite a gallery of supporting characters on both the protagonist and antagonist sides, all of whom play the one-dimensionality of this universe to its strengths, offering, for example, very self-aware performances by the greedy chocolatier trio played by the likes of Matt Lucas, Matthew Bainton, and Patterson Joseph to delightfully comedic results, as their dialogue, banter, and mustache-twirling delivery just make you smile again and again, reminiscent almost of a Radigan-type character from The Great Mouse Detective. Keegan-Michael also supports as the chief of police on the take from the chocolatier mafia, with a running gag of avalanching weight gain every time he takes another bribe, similar to Rowan Atkinson's equally pocketed head of church, who exudes that still hilarious just to look at body language that he perfected with his Mr. Bean and other characters. Kayla Lane as Wonka's initially reluctant sidekick with more of a role to play than you would imagine, Hugh Grant as a posh, ousted Oompa Loompa on a quest, Sally Hawkins as Wonka's mother who initially inspires his love of chocolate and serves as his font of goodness, Olivia Colman, who strikes you as a kind of bargain Madame Thénardier, though this is no bad thing, as well as almost a dozen other supporting characters, each with their human moments, like amending unrequited love in unexpected ways, a side theme also present in Paddington 2. Finally, also like Paddington, which explored social issues such as immigration with a very light hand, Wonka provides just a dash of social commentary by touching upon the concept of corporate greed and doing so without becoming overbearing, which is personally something I'm always thankful for, as any social issue invariably requires complicated conversations with multiple sides to them and are best not simply shoehorned into films as one-note preaching. So I am indeed glad Wonka didn't attempt anything too heavy-handed on this front, as the same cannot be said of some other films in the modern era. As a quick interlude, if you've enjoyed this review so far, feel free to subscribe to the channel for future content like this, as it greatly helps this channel grow and encourages me to continue making videos like this. Now, let's get into the criticisms. Funnily enough, a number of the positives that I mentioned I would also consider to have a dual-edged effect. For instance, while the universe portrayed in Wonka is quite one-dimensional, which the director and all actors involved heavily lean into to light-hearted and enjoyable results, this lack of depth can also very much leave you wanting more. Wonka mostly feels like a palatably sweet, chocolate-covered confection with a single enjoyable flavor, and with nothing beyond that, it isn't something you'd be likely to revisit after you've already had it. Wonka is a very much by-the-numbers film, and while the subject matter on the screen exudes a magical realism, the film itself certainly is not bursting with much magic or even dynamism in its handling, instead opting for the competent, safe, and predictable approach at every turn. As a result, it doesn't feel like a personal work whatsoever, but rather a studio piece that hired a director for his style, which he was able to apply only so much as they allowed him. As mentioned earlier, Timothée Chalamet puts in an endearing performance which I genuinely enjoyed. However, this was partly because I quickly realized how surface level it was going to be based on what he had to work with, and expectations needed to be adjusted very quickly to keep the enjoyment going. That I felt he could have done so much more with the character had he, or maybe one day will be, given the chance to, is only a credit to his performance and its soft-spoken whimsy. When compared to Gene Wilder's original 1971 turn as Wonka, however, and this comparison is of course inevitable, Timothée Chalamet's turn is one entirely devoid of any unpredictability, danger, or really much nuance. Furthermore, his character arc is very flat, with him remaining the exact same character at the end of the film as he was at the beginning. Wonka is such a safe film, in fact, that they've chosen to ignore virtually every opportunity to explore the more interesting aspects of the character, some even very obvious ones you would expect in an origin story. For example, how Willy Wonka even becomes such a prodigy and genius chocolatier is entirely missing, as when he arrives in the city, he simply already just is. Having even a single sequence or even a scene in which, via flashbacks, we see a glimpse into his travails while coming into his abilities would have done wonders to de-sterilize the character and insert some much needed subtext. Another seemingly obvious opportunity which was missed would have been by the end of the film to have the character exude even just a glimpse of something from this experience that has begun to shape him into something more than the identical, good-natured, naive, and eternally optimistic character he was at the beginning. This is a character, after all, that in every version of the source material, meaning the 1971 Gene Wilder film, the 2005 Johnny Depp film, and the 1964 book itself, that eventually even shut down his own factory and disappeared from public view entirely. And this is impossible to imagine something the one-dimensional and cloying character in Wonka would ever be capable of. The concept of exploring Wonka's origin is in general perhaps more than a little dubious, as it can deprive the character of his mysteriousness, something the original 1971 film handled perfectly, whether intentionally or not, as Gene Wilder's Willy Wonka was in equal parts charismatic, mischievous, sarcastic to a fault, but above all, a dreamer and a mystery. And exploring Wonka's origin in the way the 2023 film does, unfortunately entirely paints over this characterization with a brush that turns him into something deeply homogeneous and one note, essentially sharing the Wonka name in name and broad outline only. In fact, Gene Wilder famously stipulated that for him to agree to play the role, he had to come out limping with a cane, after which he would keel over, only to turn that into a role in which he recovers and stands upright without assistance, conveying that you can never fully trust his character or anticipate what he's going to do. Another major juxtaposition being that in all previous iterations of the material, the emphasis of being greedy, gluttonous, and rotten is firmly on the children touring the factory, whereas in this film, that negative emphasis is on the adults nearly universally, which does make sense considering a major studio film aimed particularly towards children in the year 2023 is certainly not going to have the thesis that children can be incredibly spoiled, highlighting some interesting differences in the time we live in today versus when the original film came out. What those differences might be, I will leave you to consider. So in summary, I believe Wonka has some very enjoyable elements to it, and so long as I accepted this film for what it was, I genuinely enjoyed it throughout. This is actually, in my view, a very necessary thing to do with films in general, as building up expectations you have for a film can sometimes really get in the way of your enjoyment of it because you're expecting it to be something it isn't. At the end of the film, there's a very well-timed rendition of Pure Imagination, which is just such a beautiful song and something I could rewatch endlessly in the original 1971 film. And choosing to have this piece at the end is a nice way for them to attempt to bridge these films together, denoting that Wonka is becoming the man he one day will be, at least in this respect, with the critical component of one's pure imagination. All that said, Wonka is as by the numbers and safe as you can get from beginning till end. This makes it a great choice for those who want an enjoyable balm to experience in the holiday season, maybe with friends and family, but for those looking for something with really any kind of deeper subtext or depth for the Willy Wonka character, expectations will really have to be reined in, as this clearly was not the intention by its creators, and these are definitely not the droids you're looking for. Now I'd love to hear from you below. Have you seen the film? And if you have, what were your thoughts? Did this analysis resonate with you? Were there things you agreed or disagreed with? Please let me know in the comments. If you've enjoyed this video, please also feel free to like and subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel out, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next one.